Hi again, we're looking now at motion blur in exercise 9. Okay, so I've got my feet imported in here. Let's go to a new session and we will call this motion blur 001 and hit OK on that. So it seems to be we've got a nice bit of green screen, and then halfway through the shot the floor cuts off. So we have to come in and make a lovely, very lovely mask going on here to cover up that little area here. And let's take a look. And we've got a fair amount of motion blur to contend with. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. So I'm going to be evaluating a few different techniques that we can use to get rid of that, and show a couple of other features as well. Alright, so let's have a little look here. This is actually probably a good excuse to, if I come to my session settings here, come into the keyer here, probably a good excuse as any to show you the green screen coming in. We really only have a couple of controls over it. We have the background and the foreground. So let's take a look at the primary map there. So very, very simple, very straightforward. And the foreground brings that back in. Cool. And we could use this, except for one thing. Let's zoom in a little bit here. We really can't get the, can't blur that up. We can't wrap that well. The wrap actually looks quite okay here, or better than it did before. We can't really shrink or grow that or soften it in any other meaningful way, because we, let's come up here. I'm just going to turn this little lightning bolt off over my nodes list here, and this will turn off the particular node. So if I do this here, I'm going to lose the motion blur around the toes. So this key is really not designed for this kind of project where we need to keep in the motion blur, even at any point. It's just too harsh. So let's get rid of our key here. We don't need that anymore. Well, let's concentrate on this foot here, because this should give us a good, reasonable way of working. And let's take a little look at what we can do. Let's see what we actually need. Let's analyse the shot, see exactly what we need here. See the smallest number of shapes we can break this into. I'm thinking probably one for the foot, one for the toes, and one for the big toe. That should be enough. Cool. Alright, look back at the shot here. Are we going to get anything from motion tracking it? Well, no seems to be the answer there. There's a little bit of camera bounce going on, but really we can't. I mean, if we can't really grab any of these markers here, because the relationship these markers have to our girl's legs here starts off fairly relevant and goes to almost zero relevance at the end here. So we're not actually going to get anything out of motion tracking it. We're just going to have to do it the old-fashioned way, the hard way. Cool. So let's start up our new layer, and let's call this foot left, which is this one here, and let's break this into the objects we need. Now, remember, most of this is going to be done just with a key, so we don't have to worry too much about it. But what I am going to do is I'm going to give myself quite a bit of, well, for want of a better pun, leg room, just so that I can blend in the keyed footage with the roto footage when I need to at a later date. So let's come in, let's take a look at this. So I'm going to do one for the leg as well. Not loose, but actually fairly straight with this, strict with this, because I can always bring this in a little bit later. Cool. We will call this what's it called? Shin. And that's the left because it's all in my left foot. So let's call that shin. Come in here. Might need to just tap that in just a little bit. Bring that curve in a little bit more. Cool. And let's really quickly animate that through. I'm only going to animate from frame 29 onwards. So let's come into my first work area here. Change the first frame from 1 to 29. And I'll quickly just rotate this out. Cool, that's looking not too bad for a quick one. And let's come in and lock that, change the colour of that to something a bit darker. And come in and do the next bit. And this bit here is going to be the main foot. Again, using the X-spline there just to describe this shape. As you can probably tell, I'm a big fan of the X-spline. I just think with organic shapes like this, it works out really nicely. So that's our main foot. Let's come a little bit more here. So one of the problems we've got now straight away is actually because this edge is soft, where is it that we're going to be putting our edge? There's a couple of different schools of thought on this. Now, something that's just a little bit blurry, I would actually go to the sharp edge here, because we know we can come in and blur our footage up a little bit here, and we have control of going out or in. So you could actually take the whole thing out as well and blur it inside, or go to the sharp edge and blur it outside. I tend to go to the sharp edge and blur it out rather than go the other way around. But because we've got motion blur adding to this as well, I would definitely go to the sharp edge to begin with and see what we end up with when it comes to the blurring. And there's another thing we can do which we are going to look at as well. Again, that also leads to going to the sharp edge first. Cool. So let's animate this out. Cool, and so far so good. That's looking pretty good as well. Doing this all fast for the recording. And so let's lock that up, change that colour. And let's come in and do our set of toes here. I'll do both sets of toes and then join you back. Cool, just one thing, I'm just going to break in a second here and just show one thing that I would do here. I'm using a Bezier spline here. With shapes where you have to use the reshape for, I would avoid breaking the handles if at all possible. Handles can be notoriously tricky to animate through and get a nice consistent result. So, so wherever possible, avoid breaking the handles, and also keep everything set to cardinal if you can. And again, that sort of just tries to avoid any of those nasty, harsh changes wherever you can. All right, that's I'll just carry on now. Cool, all right, and let's take a little quick look at that. That seems fine. I didn't do the big toe. I'll leave that for you to do if you really fancy it. But we've got the other stuff going in. That should be good enough to understand what's going on. Actually, I will just do the big toe. It won't be a second, because we have got most of it covered in with the other splines. Cool, and at that point there, I'm going to turn it off. And remember to make it active from there as well. All right, okay, so let's take a quick look at that now. And that's looking all right. Let's see what we can do with the motion blur. Because we can see we are still missing out on quite a big chunk of that effect there. So let's turn the motion blur up on all of these. Unlock everything here. Motion blur is turned on. And let's come to our node. Motion blur is enabled in there as well. And let's take a look at our alpha. That's looking pretty good. We seem to have covered where we need to have covered, except for that area there, which I think is more a shape problem than anything else. Reshape that just a tiny amount. Cool, but I think the motion blur here has got us pretty much covered. I like that, and that's nice. Now, the only other thing that I fancy doing is actually blending this area up here, because I know that when it comes to it, I'm going to want to make a much softer blend happen between this stuff of the leg that I'm going to key out and this stuff that I'm going to be leaving in. So I want to make sure that I can blend that in quite nicely. So we've got another little tool here, which is our feather tool. So let's turn motion blur off for the time being in the node, not in the object bin. There we go. Cool, and let's turn the outlines on, which we've got. So this overlay turned on. Let's go to the shin and make this really nice and bright orange. The feathering silhouette is handled in a really interesting and clever way. We've seen, and let's just come to this one here. We've seen how we can come in and blur everything up. And we have control over the blurs, whether the blur is centered, inner or outer. But the really cool thing is we can actually blur stuff or feather edges on a point by point basis. And here's the genius part, is that it doesn't have to be the same points that are connected to any of these things here. And that's actually brilliant. Let's show you what I mean. Let's come in a little bit here. And now with my feather tool turned on, if I alt click on a couple of these points, so I've alt clicked and we've got one marker here, one here, one here, and one here. If I now drag these up, I can feather, or I can change the feather from being zero feathered over here on these two edges to being really feathered over on this side here. And this little shape here shows me the outer reach of my feather. So this is absolute genius. This is really useful and a really good implementation of how we feather or where we feather. So we're not reliant on, let's reshape here. So we're not reliant on the shapes that we've actually created or the points that we've actually created on the shape. We can use completely different points to do our feathering. And if we move or reshape this, let's just check out as it reshapes. It moves proportionately to our original points. So here, let's come back to my feather over here on this one. And feather this all the way up. And I have added a feather keyframe, of course, because everything could be keyframed. So let's get rid of the keyframe I don't want, which is that one. Cool. So by using the feather tool here, we can independently blur specific vertices. And this is cool when, for certain occasions where there is just too much blur going in on an image that motion blur is just not picking up. Again, just before I finish this off, I want to show you one very last thing. And this is actually just reiterating something that we went through a little earlier, but it might make a bit more sense now in this context. If I zoom in just a little bit here, and we turn our overlays off and our alphas back on, and I turn the motion blur back on here. In fact, let's go just alpha only. This is a time where it's going to be good to look at our shutter angle, because if you've decided to roto, instead of to the hard edge of the shape, you've decided to roto all the way out past the blurred areas here, you might find that once you turn motion blur on, that your mask is now taking in too much information, more information than you need it to. So it's at this point where the shutter phase becomes vitally important. So at the moment, my rule of thumb was taking it to minus half of the shutter angle. But you can see here, if we take it to 0, this uses the, and we'll turn our things back on there. this uses the current frame as the sort of starting frame for our motion blur. So in this instance here, let's turn this up just a little bit. See, in this instance here, our shutter phase is completely out of keeping with the shutter angle. So because I rotated it to a particular area, so as we move our shutter phase back, we can see that it fits better or worse depending on where we move it. So we can find our ideal angle here. So long as you've been consistent with your shapes, we can be consistent here with a shutter phase. So I might find that my shutter phase is, or my shutter angle, I need a bit more motion blur going on. And that coincidentally has followed my rule of thumb for the shutter angle to be, also for the shutter phase to be half of the shutter angle. So if an object's moving really, really fast and the shutter angle's set up fairly high as well, what can happen is that we can start to see the separation that's going on between the various levels. So it's at that point where we can just whack our samples up here. Now Silhouette FX is really, really fast at rendering out this motion blur stuff. But generally you won't need to go past 64 samples, I wouldn't have thought. And the default value of 16 actually holds you in good stead for most of the time. Cool, I am really going to leave it there now for this time, and I hope that's been a little useful interlude into looking at motion blur and blurs in general, so the feathering in general as well. Yeah, we'll be diving into paint and effects in exercise 10 and showing how we can clean up some matte stuff using paint. But I'll see you in exercise 10.